Thank you. That's extremely kind. I almost wasn't here today. And I wouldn't normally tell this anecdote, but I think it has some relevance. I couldn't find my son after school. You know that feeling, yeah? My wife and I and my 6-year-old running around looking for him. I actually got down here at 3:30 to be nice and prepared, and I was back up to the school to look for him. We did find him, he's fine. But that feeling of parental responsibility. I once heard Louise Voigt say, children don't need social workers, they need parents. Right? And I think that's a great thing to keep in our minds. Children need parents. And that's that commitment, I suppose. What is a parent? Let's just think about that for a second. A parent is someone who is ultimately responsible for a child's well-being. Okay? Ultimately responsible. Caseworkers get changed. They move on. They have a caseload. Parents persist and are there. That's their role. Their role is to be the carers of children. And Barnardos does a wonderful thing. I think a lot of you, this will resonate with a lot of you in the room here. Barnardos allows us to be useful for children who need parents or need carers, need permanent carers and stability. As an academic, it's very hard to be useful, except to my students, which is of course a portion of my responsibility. But without organisations like Barnardos, who allow me to come and help them think about their problems, I'm useless. That knowledge that I have about social and emotional development doesn't translate to anything. So it was a great honour to be able to come and work for Barnardos, something that I appreciate immensely. And it was actually Louise Voigt who sought me out. And I've had the great privilege also of working with Deirdre, who I think is an exceptional individual. I think you're lucky to have her. And Louise's view was that we need some different perspectives on children. So I'm going to get to that and talk a little bit about that in a second. So I've been overseeing a piece of work on children's identity formation in the context of open adoption. Are most of you familiar with that piece of work? Have you come across it? Yeah. Now that represents a very small number of children that Barnardos cares for. So, you know, it's just that perhaps we might describe it as a tip of an iceberg. But I think it's a very significant a portion of children. Those are the children for whom there's very little chance, no, let's be honest, there's no chance of restoration. And there's no chance of kin care in these particular cases. In fact, when Louise Voigt first spoke to me about this group of children, I said, well, you want me to do a major piece of research on what, 10 children or something like that? You know, like, is this utilisation of resource justified? And she said, no, you'd be shocked at how many children fall into this category just in New South Wales. So we need some clear thinking around the strategies there. And together with Lynn Mogger and Sutra Giegel, I was able to help think around some of those problems. So let me say a little bit about that work that I've done. There's a report, I think it's due to be published any day. Yeah. The Institute for Open Adoption Studies at University, congratulations on being involved in that. I'm not part of that, although I'm very happy to be a research collaborator with the Institute. I'm going to publish a report on children's identity formation in the context of open adoption. And this report is in some senses about open adoption for under 5 children from non-Aboriginal backgrounds in the New South Wales legislative context. It's a super specific question. But it's also a report about the needs of children, right? And that's where my particular expertise becomes relevant. Different people have different views on children. Different people have different training, different people have different perspectives. My perspective has always been to try and understand children. So when people ask me to get involved in parenting workshops or write parenting books or do parenting radio shows or do parenting television shows, I always say no, almost religiously say no. And the answer is it's not my place to tell parents how to look after their children. Right? My place is to help people understand children so that they can take care of their own children. So that's my perspective. It's different to the social work perspective. So I did this work, I brought on board very quickly a woman called Amy Conley-Wright, who's a colleague at Early Start. And I will say a few words about Early Start in a minute. But I thought I need a social work perspective here because, you know, you don't know what you don't know. You don't understand the world that you don't operate in. And then we had an excellent researcher, a young woman called Betty Lou, who's got a training in developmental psychology and who conducted some glorious interviews with young people who've been adopted through the Barnardos Find a Family program over the years. Some 9-year-olds, some adolescents and a few young adults. What we learned, if I can just sort of distill the things that we learned and that I learned as well, and some of which I reaffirmed, adoption's a very, very good option for children. Did you know that? You probably knew that already. Yeah? But it's not an uncomplicated issue. When I say it's a good outcome for children, what do I mean? What do I mean? I had this conversation with Louise. I said to Louise, right at the beginning of this report, I said, we have certain standards of evidence in developmental psychology, developmental science, educational psychology. I will apply those standards of evidence, and Louise, you might not like what I find. And she said to me, well, fine, I won't use it then. But the point that I was asserting really to Louise was that this work has to be independent. I have to be able to stand up, despite the fact that it was funded by Barnardos, I have to be able to stand up and put my own academic reputation on the line here. And so we did maintain a certain standard of evidence, and we worked very hard to define what an identity is, what contributes to robust identity. These are not uncomplicated questions. Identity is a slippery construct. It's not something like height. It's not even something like IQ, which is also a slippery construct, but at least you can, argue that you can measure it. But identity? People's identities are different in different contexts. Sometimes people's identities are contradictory. They feel one way about themselves in one context and a different way about themselves in a different context. They're at odds with themselves. But we know that's true, right? We all know that that's true of identity. So the task here was to sort of, if you like, clear out the noise, say, all right, foundationally, if we're talking developmentally, what really matters for a child? Well, we can get back to the basics, things and a lot of those things you can measure. Does the child feel safe and secure? Does the child succeed at school? Does the child have, behavioural problems or issues or emotional problems? These are things, to some extent, give or take, you can measure. And then you get to the more ephemeral things like, how does this child feel about themselves as a person? What's their self-concept like? What's their self-esteem like? Now, all the evidence across the literature is not evenly distributed across these areas. But one thing I can tell you with absolute certainty is that if you compare children who've been adopted with children who've not been adopted from the same circumstances, okay, that's really important. The children who've been adopted do much better on all those sorts of outcomes that I just described to you. Things like performing in school, not having excessive emotional problems, etc., etc. Even physical growth, okay, for the very extreme cases. And another way we can ask this question is, what happens to children who've been adopted early versus children who've been adopted late? And again, it's the same story. The children who've been adopted early do better than children who've been adopted late. These findings are not controversial, actually. I was very reassured by the literature, by the body of work that underpins the legislation. It's very sound, okay? So it's almost like a principle. But the story doesn't end there, right? Because we all know that the needs of children who are adopted, children in care, are complicated. And we all know that one day you're very likely, in many cases, not every case, in many cases, and this is I'm talking a bit dramatically here, but you're likely to have a day of reckoning where a child says, or a young person says, why was I adopted? Why didn't people care for me? Why was this done to me? And we have to give an account of that to the child. And the best account to give of that is the one that they're already aware of through open adoption. If a child has a sense always that they were adopted, they have a truthful narrative around that, they won't feel betrayed later on when they learn new things. If they've gone on the journey through adoption with a family, then they have a robust, and this I think is one of the key findings of the report, they have a robust sense of themselves as an adopted person, all right? And part of that implies an ability to be able to ask questions, an ability to be able to seek information. And so here, I never miss an opportunity to tell people about child development. So you probably know this already, but I'm telling you anyway, right? So children change. But we rigidly apply constructs to them which are unchanging. And the classic example of this is attachment. We talk constantly about the child's need for strong attachment relationships, so much so to the point, and it's true, children do have a need for strong attachment relationships, secure attachment relationships, for attachments. Wouldn't deny that for a second. But this is a flawed way to think about the child's needs throughout development. Totally flawed by itself. It's not in and of itself wrong, but it's not enough to understand, to anticipate the child's needs through development. You have to think of the child as a thinker, not just someone who needs comfort and care and security. The child needs information, they need knowledge. Did you know, let me tell you a bit of developmental psychology you may not be aware of. How old do you think a child has to be before they know, through their experience of you, whether you are a reliable or an unreliable source of information? 6? 7? Well, between 3 and 4 years of age, 3-year-olds are fairly trusting. By 4, if you've proven to be an unreliable source of information in certain domains, the children won't remember what you tell them. And if you need confirmation of that, go and sit down with some 4 and 5-year-olds and talk to them about expertise. They understand expertise. They understand if you want to know things about the body, you should go and talk to a doctor. And if you need to save someone in a house, you should get a fireman. Right? They get that. They know that certain people hold certain knowledge and they can get that knowledge from people. And when they get it from the right people, that knowledge sticks in their minds much better than when they get it from someone who they have found in the past to be unreliable. So what does that imply about children who feel that we've withheld the truth from them? That we've denied them information about themselves? Once that realisation is firmly in their mind, it's going to be very hard to move. And indeed, that's been the case. I think for anyone who's worked in adoption, that's been the case. You will have observed that. For children who felt a breach of trust, it's extremely difficult to get that trust back. So children don't just trust in the emotional and physical aspects of relationships. They trust in the informational and intellectual and narrative aspects of relationships. And this turns out to be acutely important for adoption. Because as the child is growing, they're forming a, if you like, and this is a metaphor, they're forming a narrative sense of who they are, where they fit. And they will grab from their society, their community, important pieces of information that they feel that they need to give an account of themselves and be satisfied with who they are. We might stand back as intellectuals and say, well, why does it really matter who your real mother is? And people have said this stuff, right? Okay. It doesn't matter what your argument, how compelling and powerful your argument is. If that child needs that information, it's experienced as an acute need. Sometimes an absolutely overwhelming need, right? And I think it's for anyone who's been working in adoption over a period of time and you've seen children through development, or permanent care, fostering, and seen children through development will have come, in fact every parent will have come across aspects of this at some point. It is hard though from normal domesticity, to understand how powerful some of these needs can be. Because when you take something for granted, it's hard to identify the intensity, it's hard to identify with, or to relate to the intensity with which it is felt in someone who doesn't have the same experience as you. And that's how it feels, I think, to be a child who's been adopted and denied information about who they are. And forget adoption, this has got nothing to do with adoption actually. It's the same for all sorts of individuals. I was looking closely at work by an ABC journalist, Sarah Dingle. I don't don't know if any of you came across that. She was a child born by artificial insemination from anonymous donor. She has led a one-woman crusade over the last 24 months to find out what her origins are. She has a need to know. Okay, so it's not an adoption issue, it's a human issue. It just takes on particular salience in adoption. And furthermore, because we're all intelligent people, we know it's going to be an issue. The child is not in a privileged position to anticipate his need or her need. But as people who care for children, we are in a privileged position to anticipate their needs. And one of those needs is the need to be able to change. Change in relation to what you're doing, what you think, what you need. And we see this again and again. What a 9-year-old child who's happily ensconced in a perfect little family feels she needs is completely different from how she experiences the world as an older adolescent, coming to terms with the fact that she was adopted. Her needs have changed. And we need ways of thinking about children and structuring our approaches to children that respect those needs. And I think that's something that's really come out of this report. So let me just say it again. Children are not in a privileged position to anticipate their needs, but as the people who care for them, we are. And children need the capacity to change. If you put that together with what I told you about information earlier, they need the capacity to revisit again and again questions about who they are, where they come from, why they were put on this earth, why people have done certain things to them, and so on and so forth. And so I think if you put that together with the message that I gave you earlier about the sort of hard empirical facts about adoption, you get a very good picture about how adoption works well. It works well when it's done early. It works well when there are good reasons for it. Why is that, you say? Well, because one day you have to tell this child why they were adopted, and those reasons have to be acceptable to them, right? And there are other reasons as well, but from that, that's how I see the world. And it works well when you adopt a position of communicative openness. Now, not all of our procedures and legal frameworks and practices are necessarily aligned to that outcome, but that's, like I said, a finding of the report and something I think that by creating the possibility for this piece of work, and thank you, Deirdre, for continuing to support it as it grew, that is an outcome that I feel the team are very proud of, is being able to articulate something which we think has long-term ramifications for children in out-of-home care. So I've said a lot about adoption. I suppose I'd be misleading you if I didn't tell you that I've gotten a lot of negative emails over the last couple of years. Adoption is a really tender issue, and rightly so. Rightly so. And I think a lot of people have assumed, because we've done this piece of work, that we are just adoption advocates. I'm not an adoption advocate. I have an adopted sister. I have 2 foster sisters. Right? I don't think adoption is a cure-all or a panacea, but I think under the right conditions, it is the least worst option. That's a very negative statement, the least worst option. So let me just say a few more words and then I'll wrap it up, all right? I'll indulge myself. I don't know if you'll feel indulged, but I'll indulge myself now for a minute. In my spare time, I read a lot of philosophy. I was at Corpus Christi College in Oxford, which is a great privilege, and there was a scholar there called Isaiah Berlin. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work. But Isaiah Berlin was a very staunch critic of a way of thinking about moral issues that is quite popular. And that way of thinking is called utilitarianism. And that's the way of thinking where you say, this is the least bad option, so this is the morally correct option. And I think there's a bit of that in our society, isn't there? We feel, or we see people feeling self-righteous or justified in what they do because, all things being equal, this is the best option, so morally it's the correct option. And Isaiah Berlin smelt a rat. He saw through that in about a nanosecond. And what he said was, actually, both decisions can be bad. All right? The fact that you're taking the least bad option is a moral decision, but it doesn't make the decision that you took free from causing harm, and it doesn't not have moral consequences. And this is adoption and foster care and permanency planning. It is a perfect example of these issues. It's wrong to take kids away from their families, right? But it's the least bad option. And there it is, as simple as that. And I think when we accept that, we think much better about how to care for the children whose needs we are in a privileged position to anticipate, all right? And if we can't stand by the actions we've taken and give a narrative and reasons for those actions which are satisfactory to the children whose lives they've affected, then we might have made some mistakes in what we've done. But if we can, it doesn't mean that we're morally self-righteous. If we can, what it means is we've walked that narrow path, that very difficult path about balancing the needs of the child in a complex environment where there's no ideal solution. But if we can say to a child, if we can assist them on their journey along the way in such a way that we can say to them, this is what we need to do now because this is in your best interests. And it's not without harm and it's not easy, but it's what we have to do now. If we can do that, then we're serving children well. And that's actually the challenge of parenting very often. It doesn't seem so intense as it does in the out-of-home care system. But the same principles apply. So on that note, I would just like to thank again Barnardos for allowing me the privilege to be useful, to put my knowledge to use. I hope it has been and will continue to be of use. So thank you. And I'd like to congratulate the people in this room who support Barnardos, and it's such a heartwarming thing for me to see rooms like this filled up with people who give their time and their passion and their love to a cause and to a cause that has so much value. So thanks a lot.